Now then, this is a continuation of a Dewalt grinder video. Now that I fixed this one, and it was the brushes, but it was muck on the commutator and the brushes were in quite good nick. They were quite nearly new. Anyway, so I was using it last week, and after about 5 minutes the bearings started to groan and grind. So in other words, I think this had been scrapped, not because of the brushes but because of a bearing. And I thought, oh okay. Anyway, I've done some investigations on one of the other grinders, because I ended up saving 6 of these grinders, and the interesting thing was that of those 6, 3 had got brushes that had worn down and the little spring had popped out. I think it's called a Fletcher or something like that. That had popped out and stopped them working, and the other 3 had got bad bearings, and it's the bearing here on the armature, the front bearing there next to the gear box. Anyway, I realised that these grinders had been previously selected because they weren't working. So, you know, there could have been a company with 20 of these and 6 had packed up. So we're not saying that half of Dewalt grinders the brushes pack up and half the bearings pack up, but it seems to me that this one had really good brushes but a bad bearing, and so it hadn't done much work and the bearing had collapsed. And as you saw in the other video, you know, the bearing had totally collapsed in that. At the tail end of that video where I was talking about the brushes, I took another grinder apart and the bearing was just toast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one apart and show you how to replace that front bearing. It's quite easy and you don't need many tools. You need a little electrical screwdriver to hook the brushes out. You need a set of circlip pliers and a 10mm spanner. Yeah, and that's about it. The bearings actually come out the housings and off the shaft very easily, so it's not a difficult thing to do. My phone's just ringing. I'll catch up with you in a minute. And the other thing you need is a T20 torque. Just, you know, it's just like an Allen key, but it's that star drive, so it's a torque. So let's crack on and I'll show you what the score is. So the first thing to do, as I did the last time, is 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. So take that lot off first, then that lifts off and that's removed. Okay. Can we see? We can see. Shall we zoom in a bit? So there, like that, is the spring for the brush, and then hook the brush out. And you need to remove these so that the bearing at the back here on the armature will come past the brushes, because once you pull this armature out, the brushes will spring in and then probably lock against the bearing. So take the brushes out first. Okay, next thing. And this inner blade clamp is sort of held on there, but you lift it up with 2 screwdrivers, and there's a rubber O-ring there, and that's what just sort of keeps it in place, which is brilliant. I think that's great, because these have been in the scrapyard. It's that O-ring that makes that these are still there. So next thing, let's just zoom in a bit. Now you can see there are various notches. Okay, so this lever here, you press that lever in and you can move this round, and just here there are two tabs, and you've got to line those up with that big notch. Okay, and it just lifts out like that. There we go. Right, so that's that out the way. Then we remove this, which is the lock. And when you put this lock back in, come on, it's a long, that's it. It has to go behind that spring down there. That's better. There's the spring, and when you put this back together, the square end, and you put it in like that and like that, and then put the bolt in place. Okay, so that's that bit. Then with the torque again, the T20 torque, we remove 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bolts from this output shaft bearing assembly. So I'll just do that. So those are undone, and this should come out. Might just want a little bit of encouragement. There we go. Okay, so that's the bearing assembly, and that runs very smoothly. Good. So now in here we have there's a nut there. That nut holds this spiral gear on there. Okay. But to be able to undo that nut, yeah, we really could do with undoing 1, 2, 3, 4 and pulling that whole assembly out. So we just undo these again with the torque. Okay. So that whole lot comes out then. Right, it's not the front bearing, it's the back bearing. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, the back bearing has collapsed. Well, I'll be. There must be some really duff bearings in used on these for that to collapse that quickly and easily. So we need to take off that, and I doubt if we'll be able to see, but let's just zoom in. There's the outer, and there's the inner, and we need to get that inner off that armature. But because that's got a, how on earth the back bearing collapse like that? Perhaps they're made out of, I don't know, but with good brushes that shouldn't have worn that much. But I'm going to have a look at the front bearing as well, because it could quite well be that the front bearing is made out of mozzarella cheese as well. So we'll just go over to the bench, over to the vise, and put the armature gently in the vise to undo the nut that holds the whole gear assembly together. Okay, let's put this gently in here, trying not to damage anything. What's that bearing like? Well, can you see that movement? So we've undone that nut gently. Well, there we go. Okay, let's go back to the other bench now. Let's hook the nut out. There's the nut and the gear. There's the gear. Right. Can you see that there is a circlip? There's an eye and there's an eye. Yeah? Okay, so that circlip needs to be removed. Hence we've got the circlip pliers. Right. It's like all circlips. It can be a bit tricky. Yep. And the main thing is it doesn't want to go flying across the workshop. So we've got that. And there's the bearing. Okay, now the last one I looked at, that bearing came out very easily. So let's just see what happens this time. Can we see? Right, we've got a drift here. And it's popped out. So there's the bearing. It doesn't feel that bad. No, it feels quite good actually. And I'm just going to show you this housing. Okay, I'll just wipe that out. So on this housing there is an O-ring there that seals round the bearing, or it is a it helps the bearing sit in there. See, they go in quite easily, so it's not you have to warm this up and then knock that out, or you have to press them in. They go in quite easily. There we go. So if it was just this front bearing, which is the one that I've seen pack up on the other one that I repaired, then at that point it comes off of this shaft relatively easy. It's a nice sliding fit, and that's obviously a benefit. And when you put all this back together, you have to put the bearing in there, put the circlip in, and then you put the shaft through the bearing, and that goes on there, and then the nut goes on there. And of course tightening the nut up pushes this against the inner part of the bearing, and the inner part of the bearing pushes against there, so it all locks together with that nut. So it doesn't need to be mega tight on the shaft. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now, because we've got the back bearing collapsed, which is like, what? Why would that collapse apart from there was no grease in the bearing and maybe the bearing in inner or outer wasn't hard enough or what have you. So I'm just going to go back over to the vise. I'm going to grip hold of that in the vise and see if I can twist that off, because there's no way hardly that you can get to remove that. Otherwise I'll have to get the Dremel and just cut through that and split it off. Now luckily in my box of miscellaneous bearings, yeah, I have found some of these bearings, and they're actually the same bearings that was used in skateboard wheels. I will just read what it says on the seal. There we go, it's a 608. Okay, noise alert. I wasn't able to get that off, so I'm just going to cut through it with a Dremel. Just a bit wary of cutting into this seal and cutting into the shaft. I'll just go back to the vise and just see why I can wind that off now. Okay, I've removed that piece of bearing, and it is a smaller bearing. Now, will we be able to focus? And it looks like a 507. So it's a different bearing, and there's the number if you can read it. So there we go. I actually took that shaft down a little bit with a bit of 60 grit paper. Just took a couple of, well, maybe 1 thou off it or something like that, because I felt it was a wee bit tight. So you just rub the paper around it to remove a little bit of material, and the bearing still knocked on but nowhere near as tight. And I've put some grease in there and kept the seal that I've disturbed on this end, so therefore when it goes in the case, focus, it won't be a problem. So we're ready now to start putting it back together. So this is the bearing that came out of the front. I'm just hooking the seal out, and I think I'll put some grease in there. I mean, that's a bit too much. One could maybe leave the seal off on the gearbox side, because the gearbox has got grease in it, but I'm not sure. So that's plenty of grease in there, and we push the seal back in. Too much grease and it'll give hydraulic lock. but that seems to be fine. So that bearing then goes back in the case. Let us zoom out a little bit. Everything's getting a bit greasy. So that bearing now goes back in that case. Yeah. And we make sure that it's far enough in, and then we put the circlip back. The one that didn't go flying halfway across the workshop. Okay. Push it in once you've got it compressed and within the enclosure, so it locks in place. Right, that goes through there like that. Now this is the tricky bit. You need to put the gear the right way round, down in that there, like that. Okay, then we need to push this through, which is why they have to have just not what you would call a tight fit there, or else you won't be able to get all this lot together. Right, just in there, and you won't be able to see because of the grease, but just in there are the threads, so one needs to pull that back a bit to be able to get the nut in there like that, and then push the shaft forward and wind the nut onto the thread. Okay, and then tighten her up, and it wants to be good and tight. Okay, so I'm going to put this armature back in the vise and tighten that nut up. But that's as easy as it goes to chase that bearing. It's just a bit weird that the back bearing had packed up and the front bearing was alright, whereas on the last one the back bearing was alright and the front bearing had collapsed. But you know, why on earth a back bearing would collapse when there's actually not a lot of stress on it? That's weirder than the weird thing. Right, I'm just going to tighten that up. So I've tightened that up. Now, as I say, it needs to be real tight because it's that nut that compresses everything. If you don't tighten it up enough, when you start using that, this gear will start spinning on the shaft. So what do we do next? I think we put some grease in here. I could wash all that out, remove all that grease, etc., or I can just put some other grease in there as well, just to make sure. And then on this here, let me just zoom in a bit. You see this spring here? That spring there, that goes that way round and there. So it's facing the motor. Where are we? So it's facing the motor. There's the spring. Okay, so we just push this in. And tighten up, and then tighten up all those bolts, just the ones that go around the outside. So I'm just going to do that, and they're not self-tappers. There's 5 shortish, they're about 3/4 of an inch long, or 20mm or something of that ilk, and you just tighten them down gently ish, so you pull that whole thing together rather than tightening one and then going and putting the next one in and tightening that right down. You want to pull them all together, down together evenly, so you're not putting undue stress on everything. So I'm just going to do that. Okay, they're good and tight like that, and then what we can do is we can just put this in there like that and do the 4 screws up, which are these here. Okay, except I've got that wrong. I've just looked at the other machines. Mind you, I think it'd be better if the switch was there rather than on the side. Leave it there and see how we get on. If we don't like it, we can always change it. Right, that's that done. Now, if you remember, I was saying about the spring. So on this, which is the lock, where are we? It's got a square end and a pointy end. Well, the square end is the lock end. So we just put it behind the spring and twist it forward just like that, so that the spring is forcing that piece that way, and then we put the screw in. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And there's a shoulder on this screw. There we go, see it springs like that. Now if you remember, where are we? Those 2 dogs there, 1, 2, fit in that big notch there. So they go like that. Then you press this and it goes down. Okay. I'll just put the brushes back together and wire it up again, and we're done. Okay, here we are. Move some stuff out of the way, plug it in. I cleaned the commutator whilst it was out. Everything's back together. So there you go. It takes a while to slow down, so obviously the bearings, well, we know they are. They're all right. They'll do the job. So that's another one fixed. Hope you enjoyed this and found some solace if the bearings on your Dewalt 4206 have packed up. It's not that difficult. Yeah, it's, you know, it's not pressers and heating things up. It comes apart relatively easy. That back bearing was far too tight on the shaft, and that's why it could possibly have been why it packed up, because the shaft was too big, the bearing was just pushed on, and it's all a bit tight. Who can tell? Catch up with you soon. Cheers for now.